Jake Morrison woke up before dawn like he had every day for the past 20 years on New Eden Colony. The air was cool and fresh as he stepped out of his farmhouse and looked across the fields of golden wheat that stretched to the horizon. His wife Lisa was already in the kitchen making coffee, and their 17-year-old son Danny was probably still asleep like most teenagers do on weekends. Jake smiled as he walked toward the barn where his old farming equipment waited for another day of work. New Eden was a beautiful world with rolling hills and clear blue skies that reminded Jake of old Earth pictures he had seen as a child. The soil was rich and perfect for growing crops after 20 years of careful terraforming work by the early colonists. Jake and his family had been here for 15 years now and had built a good life, growing hybrid corn and wheat that helped feed the growing population of the outer rim colonies. The Morrison farm was one of the larger operations in the area, with over 2,000 acres of farmland and a small processing facility where they cleaned and packaged their crops for shipping to other worlds. Jake employed 6 other families in the area, and together they had created a tight community where everyone helped each other during planting and harvest seasons. As Jake started up his old tractor, he thought about how peaceful life had become. There were no wars or conflicts out here on the edge of human space. The nearest military base was 3 systems away, and the only law enforcement was Sheriff Ben Coleman, who mostly dealt with minor disputes between neighbors or the occasional drunk at the local tavern. Life was simple and good. Meanwhile, far across the galaxy in the dark halls of the Zirathi Empire, Admiral Vexstar studied holographic displays showing the locations of various species that had been marked for conquest. The Zirathi were the most feared military force in known space, having conquered 17 different civilizations in just 10 years. Their massive fleets of black warships struck without warning, and their ground forces showed no mercy to those who resisted. Admiral Vexstar was a tall creature with 4 arms and dark purple skin that was covered in battle scars from countless campaigns. His yellow eyes glowed as he looked at the newest target that High Command had assigned to his 3rd Fleet. The humans were a young species that had only been traveling between stars for about 50 years. Intelligence reports showed they had spread to maybe 30 worlds, but most were small colonies with basic defenses. The Admiral studied the data on his next target, which was listed as New Eden Colony. The reports showed it was primarily an agricultural world with a population of around 50,000 people. There was a small orbital station for trade ships and what appeared to be a tiny defense force with maybe 3 patrol boats. The Zirathi scouts had identified several large farming operations and food processing plants, but no major military installations. This would be an easy victory, thought Admiral Vexstar. The humans seemed to be a peaceful species focused on growing food and building homes rather than preparing for war. His fleet of 12 dreadnoughts and 30 support ships would overwhelm any resistance in a matter of hours. Then they could begin the harvesting process, where useful humans would be taken as slaves, while the rest would be eliminated to make room for Zirathi settlers. Back on New Eden, Jake finished his morning chores and walked back to the house where Lisa had breakfast ready. She was a beautiful woman with brown hair and kind eyes who had followed Jake to this frontier world when they were both young and full of dreams. She worked as a nurse at the Colony Medical Center and was loved by everyone in the community for her caring nature. Danny came downstairs, rubbing his eyes and complaining about having to help with farm work on the weekend. He was a good kid who got excellent grades at the colony school and dreamed of maybe becoming a pilot someday so he could see other worlds. Jake looked at his son and felt proud of the young man he was becoming. The family sat down for breakfast and talked about their plans for the day. Lisa mentioned that her friend Helen Rodriguez, who taught at the school, was organizing a community picnic for next weekend. Danny asked if he could take the speeder bike to visit his friend Tony Harper, whose father Bill ran the equipment repair shop in town. Jake agreed, but reminded him to be careful and to help Bill with any work that needed doing. After breakfast, Jake and Danny drove out to check on the irrigation systems in the far fields. The automated sprinklers were working perfectly, and the crops looked healthy and ready for harvest in a few more weeks. Jake felt satisfied as he looked at the results of years of hard work. This farm had given his family a good life, and he hoped someday Danny would take it over and continue the tradition. As they worked in the fields, neither Jake nor Danny noticed the small metallic object that briefly appeared in the sky before vanishing again. It was a Zirathi scout probe gathering final intelligence before the attack fleet arrived. The probe recorded the locations of buildings and equipment while scanning for any hidden defensive systems, finding nothing more dangerous than farming tools. The probe transmitted its data and self-destructed. Admiral Vexstar received the final scout report and nodded with satisfaction. The target was even weaker than expected. He gave orders for the fleet to jump to hyperspace and begin the approach to New Eden. In 12 hours, his ships would drop out of hyperspace above the planet and the conquest would begin. The Admiral expected to have complete control of the world within 6 hours of arrival. Jake Morrison had no idea that his peaceful life was about to change forever. As he and Danny drove back toward the farmhouse, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and red. It would be one of the last peaceful sunsets they would see for a very long time. The morning started like any other on New Eden Colony until the sky suddenly filled with massive black shapes that blotted out the sun. Jake Morrison was feeding his livestock when the shadow fell across his farm and he looked up to see 12 enormous warships hanging in the air like dark mountains. Each ship was over a mile long, with weapon ports that glowed red along their hulls. Lisa Morrison was hanging laundry when the first explosions began. Bright flashes of energy streamed down from the alien ships and struck targets across the colony. The orbital trade station vanished in a ball of fire and the communications tower on the hill exploded into pieces. Lisa dropped her basket and ran toward the house calling for Danny, who was still inside getting ready for school. Captain Roy Bennett was drinking coffee at the small defense garrison when alarms started screaming throughout the building. His 3 patrol ships were designed to handle pirates or smugglers, not an invasion fleet of this size. Bennett grabbed his communicator and tried to contact the other colonies for help, but the aliens were jamming all signals. He ordered his pilots to launch immediately, even though they were hopelessly outnumbered. Admiral Vexstar stood on the bridge of his flagship watching the bombardment with satisfaction. His gunners were targeting what their scans identified as military and communication facilities. The small human patrol ships that rose to meet his fleet were destroyed in seconds by his escort destroyers. There was no organized resistance, just as intelligence had predicted. Jake Morrison grabbed his family and rushed them toward the storm cellar beneath his house. The heavy metal door had been built to protect against the severe weather that sometimes hit New Eden, but Jake hoped it would also stop alien weapons. As they huddled in the small underground room, they could hear explosions getting closer and the ground shaking with each impact. Danny Morrison was scared but tried not to show it as he held his mother while his father checked his old hunting rifle. The weapon seemed useless against starships, but it made Jake feel better to have something in his hands. Lisa was using her medical training to stay calm and think clearly about what they should do next. The Zirathi ground assault began 2 hours after the orbital bombardment ended. Hundreds of dropships descended from the motherships carrying thousands of alien soldiers in black armor. Admiral Vexstar expected the humans to surrender quickly once they saw the size of his invasion force. Most species gave up when faced with overwhelming Zirathi military power. The alien soldiers were 7 feet tall with 4 arms and advanced energy weapons that could punch through steel. Their armor was designed to protect against most projectile weapons, and their helmets had sensors that could track movement in complete darkness. They had conquered every world they had ever attacked and expected New Eden to fall just as easily, but when the Zirathi troops landed, they found empty farms and abandoned towns. The humans had vanished into the forests and hills, leaving behind only empty buildings and silent fields. The aliens began systematic searches, expecting to find cowering civilians hiding in basements and barns. But most of the structures they checked were completely deserted. Jake Morrison led his family through hidden trails in the woods that he had learned during 15 years of exploring the wilderness around his farm. Many other colonist families were also moving through the forest heading toward emergency shelters that had been prepared years ago, during the early settlement period when dangerous predators still roamed the planet. Sheriff Ben Coleman was coordinating the civilian evacuation using backup communication systems that the aliens had not detected. As a former military police officer, Coleman knew the importance of getting non-combatants away from the fighting area. He was surprised by how quickly and efficiently the colonists were moving despite having no real evacuation training. Bill Harper was helping families reach safety while his son Tony stayed close to Danny Morrison. Harper had been a Navy engineer before becoming a mechanic, and he understood military tactics well enough to know the colonists needed to stay hidden until help arrived. He led a group of 50 people through a canyon where the alien sensors could not track them easily. Dr. Pete Johnson was treating injured civilians at a hidden medical station in the caves north of town. Several people had been hurt during the initial bombardment, but nothing too serious yet. Johnson had served as a battlefield medic 20 years ago, and the familiar stress of treating wounded people under dangerous conditions brought back old memories and skills. Helen Rodriguez was using her intelligence training to coordinate information between the scattered groups of survivors. As a former military analyst, she knew how to set up secure communications and gather useful intelligence about enemy movements. She had established hidden observation posts that could watch the alien forces without being detected. Admiral Vextar was becoming frustrated as reports came in from his ground commanders. The humans were proving more elusive than expected, and his troops were struggling to locate the population centers that should have been obvious targets. The aliens were used to fighting conventional armies, not hunting scattered civilians through unfamiliar terrain. The Zerathi soldiers were having difficulty with the dense forests and rocky terrain of New Eden. Their heavy armor slowed them down in the thick underbrush, and their sensors were confused by the magnetic anomalies in the local rocks. What should have been a simple mopping-up operation was turning into a difficult search and rescue mission. Captain Bennett to get a message through to Earth using an old emergency transmitter hidden in the mountains. The signal was weak and took several hours to reach its destination, but it carried news of the attack to Admiral Susan Clark of the Terran Defense Fleet, unfortunately the nearest military ships were weeks away, and New Eden would have to hold out on its own. Jake Morrison watched from a hidden position as alien soldiers searched his farm. They moved through his fields, destroying equipment and burning his crops while looking for signs of human activity. Jake felt anger building inside him as he saw 20 years of hard work being destroyed by invaders who had no right to be there. Lisa Morrison was helping other women care for frightened children in the cave system where they had taken shelter. She used her nursing skills to keep everyone calm and organized while the men prepared defensive positions. Lisa had never been in combat, but she was determined to protect her family and community. As night fell on the first day of invasion, the situation was becoming clear to both sides. The Zerathi had expected a quick victory but found themselves hunting ghosts through hostile terrain. The humans had avoided the initial assault, but they were trapped on their own world with no way to escape and no reinforcements coming soon. Jake Morrison crouched in the tall grass, watching a squad of Zerathi soldiers search through the wreckage of his neighbor's barn. Something deep inside him was changing as he observed the aliens destroying everything his community had built over 2 decades. The anger was bringing back memories he had tried to forget from his days as Sergeant Morrison in the Terran Marine Corps during the bloody Centauri border wars. 20 years ago, Jake had been a different man, trained to kill enemies and protect human colonies from hostile forces. He had put away his weapons and chosen the peaceful life of farming because he was tired of war and death. But watching these invaders burn his crops and terrorize his neighbors was awakening the soldier he used to be. Bill Harper found Jake in the forest and immediately recognized the look in his old friend's eyes. Harper had served in the Navy as an engineer and knew what combat did to good men. The two veterans had never talked much about their military service, preferring to focus on building new lives for their families. Now they would need to remember everything they had learned about warfare. Helen Rodriguez was gathering intelligence from her hidden observation posts, and what she discovered was encouraging. The Zirathi soldiers were having serious problems with the local terrain and weather. Their equipment was designed for different environments, and they were struggling with New Eden's dense forests and unpredictable magnetic fields that interfered. With their sensors, Dr. Pete Johnson was treating more wounded civilians who had been caught by Zirathi patrols, but he was also preparing for something else. Johnson had been a battlefield medic during 3 different conflicts, and he knew how to treat combat injuries. He began organizing medical supplies and training other colonists in basic first aid because he suspected they would need these skills soon. Jake Morrison called together all the men he knew who had military experience and was surprised to find nearly 30 veterans living in their farming community. They included former Marines, infantry soldiers, Navy technicians, Air Force pilots, and even a few Special Forces operators who had retired to quiet lives growing crops and raising families. The veterans met in a hidden cave system that Danny Morrison had explored many times during his childhood adventures. Jake looked at the faces of men he had known as peaceful farmers and shopkeepers and realized they all had the same hard expression he remembered from combat zones. These men had chosen farming over fighting, but they still remembered how to be soldiers. Bill Harper had managed to salvage some equipment from his repair shop, including welding tools, metal cutting gear, and electronic components that could be used to make weapons. Helen Rodriguez contributed her knowledge of Zirathi military tactics gained from studying intelligence reports during her service years. Pete Johnson offered to train the other colonists in field medicine and combat first aid. The first strike came 3 days after the invasion began, when Jake Morrison led a team of 6 veterans in an attack on an isolated Zirathi patrol. Using knowledge of local terrain gained from years of farming, they set up an ambush in a narrow valley where the aliens could not use their superior numbers effectively. The Zirathi soldiers were caught completely by surprise when human fighters emerged from hidden positions in the rocks and trees. Their advanced armor protected them from most of the colonist weapons, but the humans had prepared special ammunition using Bill Harper's metalworking skills. The attack lasted only 10 minutes. But left 8 alien soldiers dead and their equipment captured. Admiral Vextar received the report of the ambush with growing concern. His intelligence had indicated the humans were a peaceful agricultural people with no military capability. The precision and effectiveness of the attack suggested his forces were facing trained soldiers, not frightened farmers. He ordered increased patrols and better reconnaissance of the surrounding area. Lisa Morrison was working with other women to establish supply lines for the growing resistance movement. Using her medical knowledge and organizational skills, she coordinated the distribution of food, water, and ammunition to the hidden camps. Lisa had never fired a weapon in combat, but she was learning to clean and maintain rifles for the men who were fighting. Danny Morrison begged his father to let him join the attacks, but Jake refused to allow his son to risk his life. Instead, Danny used his intimate knowledge of the cave systems to guide supply runs and help wounded fighters reach medical treatment. The boy's knowledge of every trail and hidden passage on the planet made him invaluable for logistics and communications. Captain Bennett's surviving patrol ship had been hidden in a mountain canyon where Zirathi sensors could not detect it. Bennett was coordinating with the civilian resistance and providing tactical advice based on his military training. He also managed to establish limited communication with other human colonies, warning them about the Zirathi invasion methods. The resistance strikes became more frequent and effective as the veterans remembered their combat skills and adapted them to guerrilla warfare. They targeted Zirathi supply convoys, communication posts, and isolated patrol units while avoiding direct confrontation with larger enemy forces. Each successful attack yielded more alien weapons and equipment that could be used against the invaders. Helen Rodriguez was analyzing captured Zirathi communication devices and learning about their command structure and battle plans. Her intelligence background made her excellent at interpreting enemy signals and predicting their next moves. This information allowed the resistance to stay ahead of Zirathi search operations and plan more effective ambush. The Zirathi soldiers were becoming nervous and frustrated as their casualties mounted and their mission objectives remained unfulfilled. They had been trained to fight conventional armies with clear battle lines, not to hunt invisible enemies through hostile wilderness. The psychological pressure of constant guerrilla attacks was affecting their morale and combat effectiveness. Jake Morrison realized that his small band of veteran farmers was actually winning against a vastly superior alien force. The Zirathi had advanced technology in overwhelming numbers, but they did not understand the terrain or the determination of people fighting to protect their homes and families. Every burned field and destroyed building made the humans more angry and more dangerous. Bill Harper had established a hidden workshop where he and other mechanically skilled colonists were building improvised explosive devices and modifying captured alien weapons. Harper's engineering knowledge allowed him to understand Zirathi technology well enough to turn it against its creators. The resistance was becoming better armed with each successful attack. Dr. Pete Johnson was training teams of combat medics who could treat wounded fighters in the field and evacuate them to hidden medical facilities. Johnson's experience in battlefield medicine was saving lives and keeping fighters healthy enough to continue the resistance. His medical teams were also gathering intelligence from wounded Zirathi prisoners. After 2 weeks of guerrilla warfare, Admiral Vextar was forced to request additional reinforcements from the Zirathi High Command. What should have been a simple conquest operation had turned into a prolonged campaign against an enemy that refused to surrender and seemed to be getting stronger rather than weaker. The resistance had grown from 30 veterans to over 200 active fighters, with hundreds more civilians providing support services. Jake Morrison found himself commanding a small army of farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and mechanics who had transformed themselves into effective guerrilla warriors defending their world against impossible odds. Admiral Vextar stood before the holographic image of Zirathi High Command, feeling humiliated as he requested additional forces for what should have been a simple farming world conquest. The Supreme Commander's 4 eyes glowed with anger as he listened to reports of mounting casualties and failed objectives. For the first time in Zirathi military history, a small agricultural colony was successfully resisting their invasion force. News of the human resistance was spreading throughout Zirathi space and reaching the ears of other conquered species who had been enslaved by the Empire. Whispers began in the slave quarters and prison camps about a small world where farmers were fighting back against the mighty Zirathi war machine. Some species that had surrendered without fighting were beginning to question whether resistance might have been possible. Jake Morrison was leading his largest operation yet, with 50 veteran fighters and over 100 civilian volunteers. Their target was the Zirathi command post that had been established in the ruins of New Eden's main town. Intelligence gathered by Helen Rodriguez indicated that destroying this facility would severely disrupt enemy communications and coordination across the planet. Captain Bennett's patrol ship had been modified by Bill Harper's engineering team, with additional weapons and stealth systems that could hide it from Zirathi sensors. Bennett was planning to coordinate the ground assault with an airstrike that would target the alien command ship in orbit. It was a desperate plan, but the resistance needed to achieve a major victory to maintain morale. Lisa Morrison was organizing the largest medical operation in the resistance's history to support the upcoming battle. She had trained 30 civilian volunteers in combat first aid and established 3 hidden field hospitals in caves around the target area. Lisa knew many good people would be wounded or killed in the attack, but someone had to care for the injured. Danny Morrison had mapped every tunnel, cave, and hidden passage within 10 miles of the enemy command post. His detailed knowledge of the terrain would be crucial for moving large numbers of fighters into position without being detected. Danny was finally going to participate directly in combat despite his father's continued objections. The attack began at dawn when Bill Harper's demolition team destroyed the main Zirathi supply depot using improvised explosives built from farming chemicals and captured alien components. The massive explosion could be heard from miles and served as the signal for coordinated strikes against enemy positions throughout the area. Jake Morrison led the main assault force through underground tunnels that emerged directly beneath the Zirathi command bunker. His fighters used modified agricultural equipment as weapons, including crop sprayers, filled with corrosive chemicals and farming tools converted into explosive devices. The aliens were caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of human fighters inside their secure perimeter. Helen Rodriguez was coordinating the battle from a hidden observation post using captured Zirathi communication equipment to monitor enemy responses and redirect friendly forces. Her intelligence analysis allowed the resistance to stay ahead of enemy counterattacks and exploit weaknesses in their defensive positions. Dr. Pete Johnson and his medical teams were treating wounded fighters under combat conditions, while Zirathi energy weapons struck the ground around their field hospitals. Johnson's battlefield experience kept him calm as he worked to save lives while explosions shook the cave walls. His teams evacuated critical casualties through Danny Morrison's tunnel network. Captain Bennett's modified patrol ship struck the orbiting Zirathi command vessel just as the ground assault reached its peak intensity. The surprise attack damaged the alien ship's communication systems and prevented them from coordinating an effective response to the surface battle. Bennett's small ship was severely damaged but managed to escape. Before enemy fighters could destroy it, the battle lasted 8 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the Zirathi ground command post and the capture of valuable intelligence about enemy plans and capabilities. Over 60 alien soldiers were killed and their equipment seized by the resistance fighters. The humans lost 12 people but had achieved their most significant victory yet. Admiral Vexstar was forced to withdraw his remaining ground forces to defensive positions around their landing sites while he waited for reinforcements to arrive. The defeat at the command post had cost him nearly a quarter of his invasion force and left his remaining troops demoralized and afraid. For the first time in his career, Vexstar was facing the possibility of complete failure. News of the human victory reached other colonies through Captain Bennett's communication network and began spreading throughout human space. The story of farmers defeating professional alien soldiers inspired resistance movements on other worlds and raised hopes that humanity could defend itself against superior alien technology. Jake Morrison realized that his resistance fighters had evolved from desperate survivors into an effective military force capable of defeating trained alien soldiers. The farmers and shopkeepers had learned to use their knowledge of local terrain and improvised weapons to overcome enemies with superior equipment and training. They were proving that determination and creativity could triumph over raw military power. 3 weeks after the major battle, the first Terran Defense Fleet ships arrived in the New Eden system. Admiral Susan Clark brought only a single heavy cruiser and 2 destroyers, but they carried advanced weapon systems and a company of Special Forces soldiers. The reinforcements were fewer than Jake Morrison had hoped for, but they represented the first outside help the colony had received. Captain Frank Miller commanded the heavy cruiser TDF Liberty and immediately began coordinating with the surface resistance forces. Miller was impressed by the effectiveness of the civilian fighters and their detailed knowledge of enemy positions and capabilities. He realized that these farmers had become skilled guerrilla warriors who could provide invaluable support for his limited forces. The arrival of Terran reinforcements changed the strategic situation on New Eden as the Resistance gained access to military-grade weapons and communication systems. Jake Morrison found himself working with professional soldiers who respected the skills his fighters had developed. During weeks of guerrilla warfare against superior alien forces, Bill Harper's engineering teams began modifying Terran military equipment for local conditions while learning to maintain and repair advanced weapons systems. Harper's mechanical knowledge combined with military technology created new capabilities for the resistance forces. They were no longer limited to improvised weapons and captured alien equipment. Helen Rodriguez was sharing her intelligence about Zirathi tactics and technology with Captain Miller's staff officers. Her analysis of enemy communications and battle plans helped the Terran forces understand what they were facing and develop effective counter-strategies. The information gathered by civilian resistance Fighters was proving invaluable for military planning. Admiral Vextar received word that human reinforcements had arrived, but intelligence reports indicated only a small force with limited capabilities. He decided to launch one final massive assault to crush the resistance before additional human ships could arrive. The admiral gathered his remaining forces for what he intended to be the decisive battle of the campaign. Jake Morrison prepared his fighters for the largest battle, yet knowing that everything they had fought for would be decided in the coming engagement. The farmers had proven they could fight, but now they would face the full might of the remaining Zirathi invasion force. An open battle. Victory would mean freedom, while defeat would mean the destruction of everything they had built on New Eden. The final battle for New Eden began when Admiral Vextar launched every remaining ship and soldier in a desperate assault to salvage his reputation and prevent total defeat. 10 damaged Zirathi warships descended from orbit while thousands of alien ground troops advanced across the burned farmlands toward the human defensive positions. The Admiral knew this was his last chance to crush the resistance before more human reinforcements arrived. Jake Morrison stood with his fellow farmers turned warriors, watching the massive alien force approaching their hastily prepared defenses. After weeks of guerrilla warfare, they were finally facing the enemy in open battle. Jake felt the familiar calm that had carried him through combat 20 years ago as Sergeant Morrison. These aliens had destroyed his farm and threatened his family, but now it was time to make them pay the full price. Captain Frank Miller coordinated the defense from his command post, while TDF Liberty and her escort ships engaged the Zirathi fleet in orbit. The human ships were outnumbered, but they had detailed intelligence about enemy weaknesses gathered by the resistance fighters. Every piece of information that Helen Rodriguez had collected about alien technology and tactics was being used to maximize the effectiveness of the limited Terran forces. Lisa Morrison worked frantically in the main field hospital as wounded fighters began arriving from the front lines. She had trained dozens of civilian medics, but nothing could have prepared them for the scale of casualties from this battle. Lisa pushed aside her fear and focused on saving lives. While explosions shook the ground above her underground medical facility, Danny Morrison was running messages between defensive positions using the tunnel network he knew better than anyone else on the planet. His father had finally agreed to let him participate directly in the battle, and Danny was determined to prove he could handle the responsibility. The boy moved through the underground passages carrying vital communications. That kept the human forces coordinated. Bill Harper had positioned his engineering teams at key points along the defensive line with improvised weapons and explosive devices designed to stop Zirathi armor. Harper's intimate knowledge of local terrain allowed him to create killing zones where alien vehicles would be vulnerable to attack. His modified farming equipment was about to face its ultimate test against professional military forces. The first wave of Zirathi ground troops advanced across the open fields where Jake Morrison had grown wheat and corn for 15 years. The aliens moved in perfect formation, using their superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm human positions. But the farmers knew every hill and valley on their land and had prepared surprises for the invaders. Helen Rodriguez was tracking enemy movements from her observation post and coordinating defensive fire using captured Zirathi communication equipment. Her intelligence background allowed her to predict enemy tactics and warn human fighters about incoming attacks. Rodriguez had become the eyes and ears of the resistance, providing crucial information that saved countless lives. Dr. Pete Johnson was operating on wounded fighters while energy weapons struck the ground outside his cave hospital. Johnson's years of battlefield experience kept his hands steady as he worked to save lives under impossible conditions. His medical teams were performing miracles in underground facilities that had never been designed for major surgery. The battle raged for 12 hours as wave after wave of Zirathi troops crashed against human defensive positions. The aliens had overwhelming firepower, but the farmers fighting on their home ground refused to retreat. Every position that was overrun was retaken by counterattacks led by veterans who remembered how to fight and kill. Captain Bennett's damaged patrol ship made one final attack, run against the Zirathi command vessel in orbit, providing crucial support for TDF Liberty's assault on the alien flagship. Bennett knew his ship would not survive the mission, but he was determined to help end the invasion that had brought so much death to his adopted world. Jake Morrison led a desperate charge against the main Zirathi assault force when it seemed the defensive line would finally break. His farmers and mechanics and shopkeepers followed him across ground they had worked for decades, knowing they were fighting for their homes and families. The sight of these determined civilians advancing into enemy fire inspired the professional. Soldiers fighting alongside them, Admiral Vextar watched in disbelief as his overwhelming assault was stopped by a ragtag force of farmers and a handful of human military ships. The species he had dismissed as weak agricultural primitives was defeating his veteran troops through sheer determination and superior knowledge of local conditions. For the first time in Zirathi military history, a conquest was ending incomplete. Failure. The turning point came when Bill Harper's engineering teams triggered a massive explosion that destroyed the main Zirathi assault vehicle and killed over 200 alien soldiers. The blast was felt across the battlefield and broke the back of the final enemy offensive. Demoralized Zirathi troops began retreating toward their landing ships while human fighters pursued them. Captain Miller's ships achieved orbital superiority when TDF Liberty's main guns finally penetrated the damaged Zirathi flagship's defenses and forced Admiral Vextar to abandon his command vessel. The remaining alien ships fled the system, carrying news of their incredible defeat back to Zirathi High Command. The ground battle ended when the last Zirathi troops surrendered or escaped to their evacuation ships. Jake Morrison stood in his burned wheat field surrounded by the wreckage of alien war machines and felt a mixture of grief for what was lost and pride in what had been accomplished. The farmers of New Eden had defeated the galaxy's most feared military force. News of the victory spread rapidly throughout known space, carried by merchant ships and communication networks to every human colony and alien civilization. The mighty Zirathi Empire had been humiliated by agricultural workers fighting with improvised weapons and determination. Species that had surrendered without resistance began to question whether they had made the right choice. Rebellion erupted across Zirathi space as conquered peoples learned that the invincible empire could be defeated by farmers with hunting rifles and farm equipment. The psychological impact of the New Eden victory was far greater than the military significance as hope replaced despair. In slave camps and prison worlds throughout the galaxy. Jake Morrison began the long process of rebuilding his farm and his community. The soil was scarred by battle and many good people had died defending their world, but the survivors were determined to restore what had been destroyed. Jake planted new seeds in ground that was mixed with the ashes of alien war machines. Knowing that life would grow again, Lisa Morrison treated the last of the wounded fighters and began planning for the medical needs of reconstruction. Her field hospitals had saved hundreds of lives during the battle and proven that civilian volunteers could perform under the most difficult conditions. Lisa had found strength she never knew she possessed. Danny Morrison helped his father repair their damaged farmhouse while dreaming of the stories he would tell his own children someday about the time farmers defeated an alien empire. The boy had grown into a young man during the weeks of resistance and would never again doubt that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. Admiral Susan Clark arrived with the main Terran Defense Fleet 3 days after the battle ended and found a world that had already won its freedom. Clark was amazed by the effectiveness of the civilian resistance and recommended that their tactics be studied by military academies throughout human space. The farmers of New Eden had written a new chapter in the art of warfare. The galaxy's strongest empire had made the mistake of attacking what they thought was a helpless farming world and discovered that humans, even in their most peaceful settlements, possessed a warrior spirit that emerged when threatened. New Eden became a symbol of hope throughout the galaxy, proving that freedom was worth fighting for, and that determination could overcome any enemy.